Hi, I'm Dylan Taylor, Chairman and CEO of Voyager Space Holdings.
I'm Alistair Funge, Space Policy and Operations Engineer.
I'm Robbie Boundy, founder of Space Impulse.
And I listen to the Cold Star Project.
And I listen to the Cold Star Project.
And I listen to the Cold Star Project.
It's interesting. If you know exactly where it is what you were looking for, you go in, you find that box, you take the box, you photograph that one document that you want, you put it back and you leave. But if you don't know that something exists to ask for it, you won't find it. But if you're doing this random shotgun effect thing, you will come up with random things that I didn't even know this was a thing. So it can, if you have the time, it actually works out very nicely.
Welcome back to the Cold Star Project. I am Jason Kanigan, the founder of this thing, Cold Star Technologies, a data science and process improvement firm. And I'm here with the one and only Nicholas Moran, also known as the Chieftain. Hey, I am super excited to have you on. We've been waiting, I don't know, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, something like that. And it is the evening, your kids are around, and if they come running in, well, folks, we're just gonna have to put up with it. And I am really excited to be able to have you on. So, those of you who have watched or listened to the episode with Andy Aldrin and myself talking about how the Soviets beat the Americans into space, and also my episode on how Albert Kahn brought mass production to the Soviets, that is the link up to how I found Nick here. And he did an episode on the development of the Soviet tank doctrine. Now, what is this doing on a space show? All these things tie together, at least in my mind they do, because they're all about how were the Soviets thinking and what did they have to work with. And if you were to listen to these 3 episodes, the Albert Kahn one, Dr. Andy Aldrin's episode with me on beating the Soviets into space, and Nicholas's tank doctrine episode here, you will really get a good picture of what their mindset was like at the time. And so I thought, I've got to have Nicholas on, and of course I have watched a rather stupid amount of your content. Nicholas here has
your wife's there. You're watching tank porn again.
Yes. So Nicholas here has a fascinating role. He's been very interested in wargaming, but he was actually a tanker himself, and I'll get you to explain that in a moment. But he works for World of Tanks, which is a video game, and they send him around to research all these tanks. And I was just talking to somebody about you before I came back to do this interview, and they were really excited. They never heard of such a thing and thought it was probably the best job in the world. And I said, well,
you will have no idea how many people say they want my job.
Right.
There are maybe 3 of us to do this. There's myself. I have a European counterpart by the name of Richard Cutland. He works for Wargaming Europe. I work for Wargaming America, both of whom manufacture World Tanks and World of Warships and a few other products. So he goes by the name of the Challenger, and he does more or less very similar to what I do for wargaming, researching in the local archives. So I obviously take care of the National Archives in Maryland. And I've gone to other archives as necessary. I've gone to the regional archives, for example, in Chicago, hoping to find for the Detroit tank arsenal, only to discover that TACOM archives are actually kept somewhere totally different, and they won't tell me where. The American National Archives are actually a bit of a mess. I don't know if you've ever tried bouncing around. At least the tank section is a bit of a mess.
I have not, but I have listened to you talk about it, and it is difficult. And I also heard you mention there's a Japanese counterpart to yourself.
There was. Tadamasa Mikiyama, what's his name? He decided not too long ago he was going to resign his position and focus on his family. So he recently got married, had a kid, and he left Tokyo and he moved to a quieter part of the country. And I've only ever been to Tokyo once. It's a hell of a town. I couldn't live there. Then again, I couldn't live in New York City. I spent 3 months living in Queens, and I felt like an ant. It's not for me. So here's me in Tokyo. I'm on top of one of the hotel towers having dinner, and I'm looking at over the vista of Tokyo, and I'm there going, if I wanted to open an office, where would I even start looking for a real estate agent out of all this, as far as the eye can see, office buildings? But anyway, so that's
too much.
The other one. Most other video game companies, when they get an expert on, a military expert, it's a contract position. So let's say Call of Duty, for pulling a name out of my arse, and I don't know if they do or not, but let's say Call of Duty are going to make a new video game. They hire a military expert for the duration of the development process, and then once it's developed, they have no further need for them. The contract is ended. But because World of Tanks is a persistent online game, it's not just a buy once and you're done. There is an argument that they want to have continued engagement.
Mm-hmm.
So what I do is not only do I go around and do research on things, but I also just provide information, good, solid, non-game related information for people. If you play a game like World of Tanks, you are probably interested in tanks in general.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I put out good information, they will come to the channel and they will learn good information. And by the way, they're also coming back to our channel. So it's
Right.
a form of marketing. And also it reaches out to people who aren't necessarily gamers. A lot of people who aren't gamers will come across my lectures or Richard's videos, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and they will be brought into our ecosphere that way. So it's good old-fashioned evil capitalism. But it works, and it's sort of a win-win. Our relationship with museums has been interesting because as a game itself, it's fun, but it's not necessarily realistic.
Right.
I don't know if you play.
Right.
If
I
you
do
don't play,
not, but
can-
I do know the difference, and I've heard you talk about steel
Yeah.
beasts as being like the ultimate in reality. Click the switch to open the hatch and all that, but it's not fun, except unless you're a real tanker, right? And so there's always that sort of swinging back and forth between fun gameplay versus historical accuracy. And you yourself were a tanker. You were a major. Tell us a little bit about that for a second.
I started off my military career in the Irish Army Reserves, the 11th Cavalry Squadron, FCA, also known as the Pedaling Panzers, because it was originally stood up as a bicycle regiment. After 3 years, I came to the US and decided that showing up for training over the Atlantic was a bit difficult, and joined the US military. Thought it might be more fun, bigger toys. No, I'm still yelling bang and throwing sticks, pretending like they're hand grenades. That didn't work out well. I joined the California National Guard, commissioned, went to Iraq in a tank, went to Afghanistan driving a desk, commanded a troop of Bradleys for a few years, and I'm driving a desk again, pending, wherever I go next, probably another desk.
Right.
You get promoted enough times, you don't have fun anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But at least compared to most officers, at least got some fun. Because if you're an engineering officer, it's kind of like, Sergeant, blow up that bridge. Or if you're an infantry officer, it's Corporal, fire the anti-tank missile at that tank. But aviation and tanks, you actually are part of the weapons system. You go with everybody. You don't send anybody. You are there.
Right.
And I know infantry guys will argue the point, but ultimately you're directing your squads. You're not pulling your trigger yourself too much. That's a theory.
Well, I have learned a tremendous amount more about tanks than I ever thought I would ever learn by watching your videos.
We'll have space tanks eventually.
Yeah, eventually they'll be called something else probably. But you go and you go to museums, you find these tanks, you get inside them, you do walk around, you go inside. I've learned more about how lousy the human factors or ergonomics were of some of these early tanks, and I'm always watching you bang your shins because you have this thing where you have to climb out of one of the hatches of the tank
as fast as
every
possible.
time.
Nobody ever talks about that.
Right?
Museums have had an interesting relationship with us. Initially, it was a case of, why do we want to talk to you? You make a mockery of real life. But then they realized, well, we're bringing people because if you're, especially in the German museum, war is a serious business, and it's not just our game. There have been the merits of making entertainment out of what is one of humanity's most horrible actions is long been debated. And you can say that for movies, you can say that for video games, you can say that even for fiction books. And what they eventually realized, though, is that we were attracting a new audience who are now coming to the museum and learning the real thing, and they're also paying the admission fees for the museum when they need money.
Right.
And we'll see the same thing for model makers. So the scale models I have in the background here, all of a sudden, ever since World of Tanks came out, a whole slew of new kits came out that most people had never knew that the real tank existed. Again, it's just sort of synergy between the audience and the rest of the industry that's around armored vehicles.
Right. And this is at least your 5th year in the role.
9.
Well, 9, yeah. So they have committed, because I know, because I've watched lectures of yours that ended up on C-SPAN 3 from 2015. And there's women in the audience, there's kids in the audience. It's not just a bunch of aging males who you appeal
They
to.
are the majority, but yeah.
Excellent. So
I mean, my audience is 98% male.
Mm-hmm.
And generally speaking, 25 to 55. So
all right.
Not many kids.
I fit right in there, but I have seen them. I have seen young people in the audience. So, so why I wanted you on especially was this tank doctrine video really got my interest, because you've done them for, and this is interwar period. How people were just figuring out how do we use these new tools, and we were imagining how we're going to use them before we actually go out and use them. And then, so you did one for the Italians, the French.
Some countries reverse that. So the Soviets definitely, the Soviets went and bought the tanks before they settled on their yes. solution. Whereas other countries, they try to come up with, like the US particularly, because the US had no money for tanks at all. So all they could do was a theoretical analysis before finally World War II kicks off and go, okay, guys, turn on the taps.
Right. There was not a lot of congressional funding for war material and products during the period in the US. We bought like something like 40 tanks between 1929 and actually even earlier, 1923 to 1938 was 40 tanks were purchased, maybe, if that. Mm-hmm. And you alluded to this earlier, the tank records in the United States are not that good. If you want to find airplane or naval records, they seem to be almost pristine. You could take the diagrams or the blueprints to a shipyard and have them make the thing. But the tanks, the stuff is a mess, and we'll get into that in a minute. But when I saw that you had done a Soviet doctrine video, I thought, where the heck did you get the information to do that? So I thought we would begin with this question. Your job not only is to crawl around on tanks and the fun side of things, and that, but you have to research and you must grade evidence. And I think that that's going to be important to this audience here. So what represents good evidence to you? How do you know it when you see it? What are the sort of the signals?
When you deal with something that's as popularly known as tanks, there is a heck of a lot of information out there. And there are some channels, for example, all they do is just put up some pictures and then read the Wikipedia entry. Well, actually, Wiki isn't the worst place to start for this sort of thing. If nothing else, go down to the footnotes and start doing the links. But since I mainly deal with the technical development more than the operational development, I go to the National Archives as step one, because there's nothing better than the original source documentation, written or typed 80 years ago, and you're the first person to actually bother to open up that box ever since. I feel pity for the poor person with the old mechanical typewriters typing all this stuff out that nobody is ever going to use.
Right.
If you ever want to learn, as I said in one video, about the effects of mold on rubber in the Pacific area, there's boxes of material out there that's already been studied, and it's freely available because it's done at taxpayers' expense in the archives. But the catch with that is that not all documentation was retained due to, I'll just call it a lack of emphasis. The practical realities in 1948, 1950, or especially once 1950 hit, is that we have mounds and mounds of paper sitting in storage, and we only have so much storage room. And look, there's a new war that just started. We need to get information from this new war. What do we do with all this stuff? Get rid of it, burn it, whatever. And they had to burn it because a lot of it was still classified. So to a large extent, part of the reason that we have a lot of the material we have is that some folks, they took it to be burned, maybe, and then they put it in their basement. And 40 years later, it surfaces, and we're getting these original documents again. If I can't find the original archive material, then the operator's manual usually is pretty good, pretty reliable. Then you start getting down into it. Basically does become secondhand sources, secondary sources, and there's no two ways about that, especially if you don't speak the language of the country that you're researching. So the only language I speak is French, at least good enough to do work with. So for the Soviets, I had to look at secondary source information, do the review or read the reviews, get assessments from other people. So for example, Steve Zaloga, who speaks Russian, is famous for doing a lot of Russian books. And I thought, hey, look, what do I want to talk? Who do I want to look up? What do I want to talk to? And that's how I got pointed to a couple of different books. So Storm of Steel was written by, you can look it up. It's Storm of Steel, the development of German and Soviet tank doctrine in the interwar period. Something like that is called. Fantastic book, covers both Germany and the Soviets very well. I have a couple of other books that I had to buy as part of my officers courses, and it covers a lot of it are interwar. So I have, what's this? Military innovation in the interwar period. It's just an analogy by different authors. The Challenge of Change is another one. Again, it's an anthology by different authors, each of whom has their own nation of expertise. Then you start going into situations where there's nothing that you consider particularly trustworthy. So you are now down to the level of, is it untrustworthy? Is there reason to doubt this information as opposed to, is there reason to believe it? Because it's the best you got. And if it's wrong, nobody can prove otherwise. So you just got to put a little asterisk on here that says the best available information right now seems to be, and then you go. That way you have your bases covered. Because something I have learned over 9 years doing this is to be very, very careful to make a definitive statement. Especially if you say, oh, this never happened, or they never thought of that, because 3 years later, somebody on the internet is going to drag up this comment and say, aha, I have found evidence that.
Okay. And Nicholas was wrong. And therefore, you must throw out everything that he has ever said.
Basically, I mean, I do try to be fairly honest. I mean, if somebody calls me out and somebody says I was wrong, I will try, my Q&A videos once a month, I will try to bring up, look, in the last month I said, here is something that this person said, make of it what you will.
Yeah. And your commitment to those is really admirable. I've watched you do those when you were tired.
1 in the morning. Well, again, you got the 2-year-old kid. Right. What choice have you?
Right. We mentioned the National Archives at College Park there. Let's give a quick picture of what it's like to go in this place, because I don't think I certainly have never even heard of it before finding your article on it and listening to you talk a little bit about it.
The National Archives is split up into the main building, which is in College Park, Maryland, and there are other satellites. It's actually NARA 2 is the one in Maryland. NARA 1 is in DC. And they have an entirely different set of documents. But for the modern period, generally speaking, you're looking at NARA 2. And as I say, there are the regional centers. So I've been to the one in Illinois, and like 40-minute bus right outside of Chicago, that sort of thing. And although I have to say that the Army section, or at least my part of the Army section that I dig into, was a mess, that is not to reflect upon the nature of the archives in general. Now, comparing how NARA works with, let's say, the British National Archives in Kew, NARA US is far better, far more user-friendly. So you have to show up, allot yourself a couple of hours when you show up to register yourself. So you have to get your research card. You have to take a course of instruction. It's maybe half an hour long on how the place operates and what the rules and regulations are. You get inspected going in to make sure you're not bringing anything like pens, which could permanently damage anything. And you also, when you leave, you will be searched basically to make sure that you're not trying to sneak anything out. Okay, that's fair. You're allowed to bring one book and one reference book and one flatbed scanner. And that reference book will be stamped to make sure that they know it's one that you brought in. It's not an archive document. You then have to hop in and they do what's called pulls. So every hour, in the morning, it's like every hour to get people going. And then in the afternoon, it turns like in every 2 hours or 3 hours. And you fill out a piece of paper that says, I want this record, this box, and you're allowed up to like 48 boxes at once. You're only allowed to have in your hands 24, but they will put 48 boxes plus a few extra on huge carts.
Okay.
And they'll keep them in the back until you're ready to take one of those 2 carts or 3 carts. So you have to go to the finding room, and there is what's called the finding aids, and it's basically a catalog of what is in the archives. So you go to the finding aid. There are people who will help you. Hey, in my case, I'm looking for Ordnance Department records, U.S. Army 1940, and the guy will say, that finding aid over there, try this one, try this one. He'll pull them down, and you'll sit down, and you can start going through the catalog. Now, oftentimes, at least for my records, the boxes are very generic. Activities of the general commanding U.S. Army Ground Forces. Now, you can imagine that the general commanding U.S. Ground Forces had a lot of different activities going on. So there's nothing for it. Sometimes there's a supplementary finding aid that somebody who has been through the records before has handwritten. This is what is in this box, and sometimes not. So it's just down to a shotgun effect. I'll just pick these 48, the first 48 boxes, and I did this for most of the Ordnance Branch records. First 48 boxes, bring them all, and then you just start opening up and seeing what you got. And if you got lucky, then great. If you didn't, then you just put them all back in, put the card back, get the next card out. And even if there's nothing of interest, there are so many boxes and so many files that the chances are, especially if you're keeping track of what was in what box, that it will be time for the next pull. They are absolutely rigid about when you fill in that form. If you are 1 second late, you've just lost an hour. You can
So go sit on your butt for an hour then and wait till the next one.
Yeah.
Wow.
There's a classified section. If you need to get into the classified section, you have to have your security clearance verified. You will then be allowed up to the 6th floor. Again, as in any secure area, you leave your pen, paper, cell phone, anything like that. And you go in, and they will provide you with a pencil and a scrap of paper that you can take notes. So, I go up, I request some boxes that were classified. Why they're classified 80 years later, I have no idea. My only thought is that nobody thought to declassify them. And the irony was that the box that I wanted to scan was already in the public domain because somebody had leaked it, or a different archive had declassified it, or whatever it was. So I now know which box I want. I have to go downstairs, I fill out a Freedom of Information request. That gets submitted. It takes a few weeks. And then for my next trip back, I can now request, because they've moved from the 6th floor, this box down to the 3rd floor. And I can now access the document with my scanner and scan the document. So it's a little bit convoluted. Right. But the people they're strict. They're very strict about all the regulations, but they are helpful. There's nobody there on a power trip. It's a case of you need to have that declassified sticker visible on your scanner. Sorry. And sometimes, hey, you're handling photographs, you must wear the white gloves that we're providing. And as I say, they're very strict about it, but very friendly and helpful. So I do recommend, if you are in the area, check it out. And if you do have an interest, it is user friendly. The guys in England that say you're only allowed to take 1 or 2 boxes out at once. It seems like, and there's a limit as to how many boxes you can take a day. For the National Archives, the only limit is how many you can basically get through in the amount of time.
Well, that gave us a really good picture. And I think you got to bring a quarter for a locker, I think you said in one thing. I wouldn't want people to go in there and wait the 2 hours and then find out they need this quarter. So you're pulling boxes. You don't know what you're going to get. It's probably going to be mold tests, and maybe it's something good.
It's interesting. If you know exactly where it is what you were looking for, you go in, you find that box, you take the box, you photograph that one document that you want, you put it back and you leave. But if you don't know that something exists to ask for it, you won't find it. But if you're doing this random shotgun effect thing, you will come up with random things that I didn't even know this was a thing. So it can, if you have the time, it actually works out very nicely.
Right. And you will go and spend 12 hours in there and not eat any lunch without thinking about it. I value my time much more than some people I work with who insist on their lunch break or, union rules. When I'm doing some video work, union rules, I must get a lunch break. But we're missing this. No, lunch break. Yeah, no. Well, we just lost 2 hours.
For a week at a time. Yeah, basically. Or thing that happened will never happen again. Yeah.
Okay. What is the most surprising thing that you can remember right now that you've pulled out of a box? That you went, wow, I didn't know this would be in here.
Well, the main one right now is the naming document. So it's various American tanks and names like Sherman, and, which everybody knows the British came up with Sherman. And the Americans did not come up with Sherman. But it turns out they actually did. Ordnance Branch did adopt it as the name, or General Jackson for the M36, or Wolverine for the M10. Now that one I still have not found any evidence for. But there's, the model manufacturers came up with General Jackson. No, look, I've got this document from 1944 that says General Jackson on it, and it will be the name. So it's sort of an unofficial official nickname is what it actually is. So Ordnance Branch said, this isn't the official name for the vehicle, but we're going to call this name in our PR releases, in our press releases. So that settled a very long-running debate in the armor community. But there's all sorts of bizarre things in there, like tanks that are turned into gliders, tests of folding bicycles, car or trucks that actually drive on water. Now, we're not talking about amphibious trucks. Yeah. We're talking about trucks with huge inflatable wheels that drive on the water. There are, what else have we found in there? There was some guy that decided to make a tank destroyer out of steam pipe, and he tied the two steam pipes. The article I wrote was Colonel Zerbe's TD, Zerbee. And of course, the ridiculous amounts of information that is of no use to anybody anymore, such as the effect of mold on rubber.
Okay. And one thing I noticed your frustration with, and I think I would have the same thing, is that as you're looking through and trying to sort of trace the course of events, sometimes you'll find that the purchasing department will have one numbering system, the project management will have another. If you could jump back in time to 1930, let's say, and change one thing about how the Department of the Army or the Bureau of Ordnance do what they do and follow that out through the next 2 or 3 decades, what would it be?
Oddly enough, the Army asked the same question. So I'm actually currently I'm writing out an article, which I'm probably going to put up next week, about how Army ground forces work with the Army service forces and the technical departments and the processes for requesting, developing, approving, and then purchasing different types of vehicles. I'm looking at all the different committees that are here. It's going, and the Army document is saying this was an unnecessary duplication of effort to do this process. So we're not talking about the numbering system where this piece of equipment is given this project number in armored forces, that project number in Ordnance Branch. That can be solved fairly quickly by a simple table, cross reference table. But it was more the matter of parochialism. We're armored force, so we must have a say in any armored vehicles. Whilst tank destroyer force are going, well, no, it's got tracks, it's fast, and it's got a gun. We have to have a say. And it will be a case of you take this prototype vehicle that was built, and they'll send it to armored force, and the armored force will test it, and that'll take maybe 2 months to test it. And then they'd send it to TD branch, and they'd take 2 months to test it. Oh, this can also be used as an artillery piece, so they send it to artillery branch, and they'll test it. And then once it has gone around all the different agencies, it'll come back, and then they'll make a decision to approve or disapprove. And obviously ordnance are going, this is stupid. Pick one lead agency, and if you are really that interested, send an observer. But the branches in the early U.S. Army in World War II were extremely controlling. And it was almost like, and this was not unique to the U.S., it was almost like their own careers or existence were in jeopardy if they let somebody else have control. Or if they let their position become optional, I think it might be a better way of putting it. They had to be part of the system in order to maintain relevance. I think that was the way that worked out. So it truly wasn't sorted out until 1945. It took that long to get.
So if you could get rid of that kind of emotional involvement, that might make things better?
That was probably the single biggest thing. And again, it predates World War II. So for example, and this, It was a congressional law, but I strongly suspect that there were people inside the branches pushing for it, that in the interwar period, the cavalry could not have tanks. The infantry controlled tanks. So if you're a tanker, you were branch infantry. And if you look at a tank of 1936-37, a tank, it will have the crossed muskets of the infantry branch on the side. But you look at a cavalry vehicle and it's armored, it's got tracks, it's got a turret, it's got a gun, it's supposed to engage in direct fire and maneuver, but it's not a tank, it's a combat car.
So we'll just change the name.
They just changed
to
the
classify
name.
it differently. Yeah. Huh.
Remind me, what state are you in?
I'm in North Carolina.
Oh, okay. So I thought, being spacey, you might be in California. California has some interesting firearms laws, which all you do is you just change the name of the firearm and you're legal. So I have a couple of firearms that way.
I see. Excellent. Excellent.
And that's exactly what happened. So when Armored Force was created, they took the infantry branch tanks and they took the combat cars from cavalry, and they just said, right, draw bloody tanks. Oh, we got a combat car M1 and a combat car and a tank M1. Okay, the combat car M1 is now the tank M1A2, and it's got no similarity whatsoever. And I think for people that the M series of nomenclature is probably the most confusing. So there's a meme going around. It's like you're complaining about your M3, and you don't know if you mean the M3 helmet, the M3 grease gun, the M3 rifle, the M3 scout car, the M3 half track, the M3 75mm gun, the M3 76mm gun, the M3 bayonet, the M3 helmet. They're all called M3 because of the way that the Army designated each individual type of equipment.
Definitely some room for improvement there. Let's finish up with a segment on you crawling around on tanks and inside tanks. You mentioned that sometimes to help the game model designers out, you will tape off squares of outer surfaces of armored fighting vehicles and then take pictures of it. And I need help filling in the blank between how that helps and they take that information and create something out of it. But tell me how that works.
Okay, so the vehicle particularly in question, although the M7 medium was also a case, is called the T-54E1. And it was an obscure prototype tank that the US came up with. And the only photographs that were commonly available were black and white, not the greatest quality in a book by Richard Honeycutt. And there are also plan drawings, actual plan drawings, but curves don't really come out on a two-dimensional plan drawing.
Right, and Honeycutt is good, by the way, folks, who don't know anything about this. Honeycutt is one of those sort of manual, like Jane's fighting ship sort of things, as I understand it.
And I'll put in a plug for my own book, Can Openers, which I tried to do in the Honeycutt vein.
Okay.
And that was material I found in the archives that I realized wasn't published, so I just put it aside.
I could put a link to that if that's out, because I think I heard you talking about it in a previous episode,
it's
but I didn't realize it was out. Okay.
So anyway, so they have these photographs and have pretty accurate two-dimensional plans. And using these plans and what they can make of the photographs, the 3D modelers for World of Tanks created their T-54E1. And after this, I can send you some images if you want to pop them up. Yeah. And my problem was I had physically seen this tank, I had measured it, and I'm looking at it, at the model, and I know in my mind, this is wrong. How do I tell these guys that it's wrong? So I had taken photographs while I was on the vehicle, so I sent them the better photographs and said, look, this is what it actually looks like. Note how it's... And the other problem was because it was a very matte paint, you couldn't actually visually discern the curves or anything. It was just kind of like a solid mass of green with no curves at all. There was no form. So I sent that over and they did a bit of work and they came back a little bit better. And I should also say that Dragon, a model manufacturer, announced a T-54E1 model kit. Again, this is World of Tanks advertising new tanks. Oh, people want to get a model of this vehicle. And the initial drawings that they released were exactly the same as the 3D model that our 3D modelers had created. So either they made exactly the same mistake as our 3D modelers, or they just took our 3D model as the blueprint, copied that. I'm not going to make any statements as to which of the two it was, although I have my suspicions. So the only way I could think of to get the image across to these people who are 6,000 miles away is contour lines, basically. So just like on a map, terrain elevation, contour lines that are all squiggles, and just by looking at how the curves are of this straight line, horizontally, you know what the terrain actually looks like in three-dimensional shape. I mean, you have a limit of fidelity. The contour line every 1 meter, is it every 10 meters, whatever, but you get the idea. So I went to Home Depot. I got a bunch of white masking tape. I started climbing around the tank, and I started putting, as best I could in the short amount of time I had available, straight lines parallel to each other if you were looking straight down from above. But if you look at it from an angle or whatever, you see they look completely different. So by doing this crosshatch, it wasn't perfect because I wasn't there with right angles when it just me literally climbing on the tank laying tape. But it was far and away the easiest way to get this three-dimensional shape across on a two-dimensional image that I could then email to the graphics designers, who then able to correctly model, or at least 99% there, the T-54E1. And I also noticed, by sheer coincidence, that Dragon also changed their kit to look a little bit better.
So maybe there's a leak. I don't know. But
maybe somebody Dragon plays World of Tanks.
How locked down is that information that you get for World of Tanks? Do they share it? Do they lock it off and say that's ours? We paid for it. I'm
not going to say it's locked down. I'm a bad academic. I often do not cite sources or anything else like that, and because most of my documentation comes from the archives. So I mean, if I cite the source, what of it? I mean, unless you physically go to NARA and you go to Record Group 156A, Section 35, Series Entry 1391 Alpha, Box 42, it doesn't do you any good anywhere. But if somebody asks me, "Do you have evidence of this?" I'll just send them the scan of the document. I mean, it's public information. It's paid for by the taxpayer. Yes, there is an argument that because we took the effort to go and we spent the money, that we should have the rights to sell the access as a service. But we've already got our value out of it. We got what we wanted, so I don't see there's any great need. So what I've actually started doing is I'm sending some of the stuff straight to the armor collection for binning. Just in case they don't have, they may have a lot of it, but I'm sending it to them anyway. I'm not doing anything else. Stuff that is obtained in other sources like the Russian archives, they're a little bit tighter about it. And there have been discussions as to just what we're going to do with it. But the other question is, if we were to make it public, how would you actually go about it? I mean, do you just do a huge folder dump? Because then you got to go to the expense of cataloging, identifying. So a problem that the British Tank Museum have is they have a huge collection of photographs, which they would like to digitize, but oftentimes the photographs have no captions, or you don't know quite what category it goes under. And the amount of man hours and work, I mean, they could, in theory, just digitize a whole lot and dump it into the public, and good luck. You may not realize that you want file number 003-24 JPG, but that's the one you want. And I think that's going to be part of the problem that we have with the Russian stuff as well. Now, that said, also a lot of the Russian stuff is also being turned into books, like I did with can openers. So I have on the shelf behind me some books actually published by World of Tanks. So can openers is a World of Tanks book, but inside it's pure research materials. And so we've done the same with some of the Russian stuff that has been translated. And that is some of the best information you're going to find on that subject around, because it is heavily researched and it's brand new. And it's researched by Russians, which of course is a big problem for a lot of Americans, especially these days. who want to go into the Russian archives. David Glantz managed to do it for a fair bit for the operational stuff. David Glantz is probably the go-to man for the Eastern Front operationally. But when it comes to just digging in the technical archives in Russia, you pretty much have to be a Russian to do it. And so these guys have done it, and they started publishing books and selling it. Well, why not? So it's not being purely kept secret. What we actually do with it, again, right now we're not dumping it in the open, but it is getting out, especially if you ask.
Okay, well, that's cool. And World of Tanks kind of got first mover advantage with it. They got to use it first. So there is good value there. I'm going to check your book out too. I'll probably link to it in the description below here. And I noticed that you see cases, because you're looking at manuals, original manuals and that, and you'll see, okay, an armor thickness is supposed to be this thick, but then you go measure it and you find out it's thicker or thinner, usually thinner, I think, right? What's the worst case of divergence in armor thickness that you could think of that you've seen?
Well, the big one seems to be between 8 inches of armor and 6 inches of armor on the T29. So part of the problem is, and this is knowing hell on me, is oftentimes the official documents don't agree with each other.
Yeah.
Even on something as you would think simple and hard and objective as armor thickness. And so I go to Honeycutt and I see Honeycutt says that it must have this. And I go to the archives and I will find the document that he used that says it must have this. But then I go continue my digging, my shotgun effect, and I'll find another document that says, actually, it has this. Which of the two do you use? So then you start thinking, well, what am I actually holding? So on one hand, I'm holding a document from the Ordnance Technical Committee. These are the guys in charge of simply deciding what they're going to build.
Yeah.
And if they're going to build it, and how many they're going to build, and whether or not it's suitable. And on the other hand, I'm holding a document written by some lieutenant in Aberdeen Proving Ground who has just measured the thing. I'm going to go with the one that the guy who's just measured it.
Right.
Regardless of what the specifications say that they should have, I'm going to go with this. So that goes back to your very original question: how do you balance different documents? And I will always go with the measured by the engineers versus over the manual. Right. Although the manual is usually pretty good over other things after that.
Cool. So if there's this is actually what we got document, that's better than this is what we asked for kind of thing.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
But even then, there were some that says, oh, this, Ordnance Branch will occasionally do project summaries. So this is something that, in fairness, they do well. So they start a project for something. It's finished either successfully or it's canceled. Either way, they will write a project summary. It's maybe 5 pages long, 5 to 10 pages long. And it starts off with, on 13th of December, 1942, a requirement was issued for whatever. Then it talks about, on this date, a request for a prototype was sent out to Chrysler to produce this thing. And on this date, it arrived in Aberdeen Proving Grounds for testing. And on that date, it was found sensitive. On that date, it was found suitable. And then it was sent to Armored Force, and so on and so forth. And then at the very end, it says, due to greater potential being found in this other piece of equipment, this was cancelled, and that was the end of the project report. So it's a good summary, and it lets you know what happened, where it went right, where it went wrong. Oftentimes, like, oh, this vehicle had great difficulty with the suspension. Doesn't go into great detail as to why, just the really high points for somebody who just wants to know why this piece of equipment didn't get off the ground. Okay,
well, that's neat. My final question. This goes back to the shin banging. What, just off the top of your head, what have been the easiest and the most difficult AFVs to get in and out of with the exit hatches for you?
There's a difference between the hatchets and the positions. There are some positions that are absolutely god awful, but they're very easy to get in and out of. Okay. Versus some which are, so for example, the the Swedish M42 gunner's position. I'm like this. Now, granted, for people who don't know me, I'm 6'5".
We're all tall,
which is definitely tall for a tanker and definitely tall for a tanker in World War II. But I figure if I can fit comfortably in some tanks, then a typical person of the time could fit very comfortably in it. And, somebody who is taller, if I don't fit at all, or if I'm somewhat uncomfortable, then somebody who's shorter will be less comfortable than otherwise. Mm-hmm. And, okay, yes, we know ergonomics wasn't a known thing per se, but it's still a factor whether you acknowledge the existence of it or not. Mm-hmm. And that's been one of those, my philosophy in these videos that I do is generally don't just read out the Wikipedia figures of this much armor and so on. This is what it is like to actually crew, because the crew are the most important part of the tank. And if they can't efficiently use it, then you have a significant problem. And the French tanks in particular are really terrible for this. So speaking of French tanks, these one-man turrets, ergonomically, oftentimes they weren't so bad. I mean, I would have shoulder room. I could sit, I could get in and out of the thing. The problem is I am one man doing everything. Mm-hmm. I'm looking for targets. I'm communicating with other tanks. I'm trying to figure out where I am. I'm instructing the gunner where to go. I'm loading the gun. The driver. I'm loading the gun. I'm aiming the gun. I'm doing everything relatively comfortably, but it sucks. And then there's something like the Comet or the FCM-36, where once you're in, it's kind of okay, but good luck getting in and out of that hatch. Again, especially if you're my height.
Right. Yeah. Well, and you are tall. I'm 6'1", and I think I'd be short around you. And then you had an older fellow on. I think his name was Hillary or something like that. He's about half your size. Yeah. Very, very old gentleman who was studying tanks since before you and I were born.
Since before I was born. Yeah. Easily. And he would have been more typical at the time. But again, so there are human factors studies. So the British, for example, would assess German tanks, and I've seen their reports. And even they would say something like, the loader in the Panther cannot stand at full height because he's only got 5 foot of 3 inches of room between the floor plate and the roof. So the typical gunner, and again, this is them writing in 1943, 1944, the typical loader cannot stand. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I don't fit, that's a given. But if the typical person doesn't fit, you're no better off, even if you're shorter.
Right.
I mean, it's
if you're 5'8" or whatever. Thing. Yeah. Yeah,
it's binary. You're under the limit or you're over the limit. That's it. And anything over that really is kind of academic.
All right. Has there been any tank where you've been in it and you've been like, wow, the crew positions are great, the visibility is good, I can get in and out?
Usually American. The Swedes have generally been good. The Americans have been very good. And I think I got spoiled in my American tank when I started going to other countries' tanks and realizing just how bad or how good the American ones are compared to the other nations. And that includes the British and the Germans. The Germans were okay-ish. They had other problems as opposed to physical space. The Russians were not the greatest. The French were probably the worst. The British were nothing to write home about either, honestly. But the Americans have always had a very strong emphasis on human factors, on usability, and the reports from the time, ergonomics may not have been a thing, but there were lots and lots of reports like the typical gunner cannot see up the eyepiece without extending himself, or the control for one hand is down here and the control for the other hand is up here, and this is unsatisfactory. Right. So the Americans are thinking about these things, and it does become a balance, all in all. So by making such a comfortable tank, the Americans also made a very big tank, which means that it's slightly less armored and it's easier to hit. Right. So it's more efficient, but it's also more vulnerable. And different nations are going to have different. So you go back to the Soviets. Well, the Soviets live by the offense. They love attacking in their doctrine. And if you're doing that, then you want a smaller, tougher tank, and you are more willing to sacrifice crew comfort because you're attacking, so you know when you're going to get into the tank. So they get into the tank, they're cramped in for maybe an hour or two at most. They charge forward in their smaller vehicles while the defending NATO tanks are bigger because they're sitting in the defensive lines for days at a time, waiting for the evil red commie horde to come at them. So they have to be in a larger, more comfortable vehicle, which has absolutely nothing to do with the combat capability per se, until you realize how tired or how, my muscle is sore. And people don't ever think about that. It's always a case of how powerful is the engine? How fast does it go? How big is the gun? And history has shown that that's not the be all and end all, or the deciding factor in any combat situation, as demonstrated particularly by World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird. You look at the German. Everybody talks about the German tanks. At the beginning of the war, they had on paper the worst tanks, but they had all the victories. At the end of the war, they had on paper the best tanks and all of the losses. What does that tell you?
Right. That how you use the tool is important. Yes.
Very much so. And also the fine details, like, okay, I have a big gun, but I only have one tiny little sight. So unless my gun is directly pointing at the target, I can't see it. Whereas the Americans have big sight up here, they have a sight down here, they got sights everywhere, they can see the target first.
And hitting first seems to be the winning stratagem.
Basically, you see the target first, you either shoot first or you run away before the other guy shoots you, depending on because you probably are not going to shoot if you don't think you can win, because otherwise, why attract attention?
Right. Well, fantastic. I've really enjoyed this, Nicholas.
Yeah, not at all.
For folks who want to find out more, where should they go? Obviously, your YouTube channel.
If you just Google the Chieftain's Hatch, that's kind of like my brand name, shall we say. So there is a YouTube channel. I have my own YouTube channel. It's separate to the World of Tanks one. I have some unique material on both. I have written articles again on the World of Tanks forum. And if you like it and you want to play the game, there's usually going to be a link somewhere that says click here to register, and it'll sign it with me, and it means that I'm working, and they'll keep me employed. That works for me. As I say, can openers is on Amazon.
Right, and you've also got a good Facebook page, which I've been enjoying. Getting an article in my feed every so often. You just put something up, that oddity thing today. I downloaded it about different equipment.
The dimensions of all the equipment.
Illustrated equipment data. Yeah,
I'm looking at equipment that academically the Army has, but you never think about it. And again, if you're talking about procurement and ordnance branch, these guys aren't just talking about what's the next tank we're going to build. It's down to the level of, do we need to design a new tin opener? And everything. Are the mittens? Do we need to replace the mittens? That sort of thing. It's absolutely overwhelming or astounding the amount of stuff that they have to develop and then ship over. And that's what that PowerPoint you have there. It's kind of, I didn't know we had those in the Army.
Right. Well, excellent. Folks, if you want more information, go to the links in the description below. Nicholas is a great guy. I really appreciate you taking the time from your evening to do this. You didn't have to.
Always cool.
So it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for doing this.
All right, not at all. Have fun. Enjoy yourself.
Hey, this is Jason Kanigan, the host of the program. Thanks a lot for listening to the Cold Star Project. If you want me to send you new episodes of the Cold Star Project so that you don't have to go hunting around for them or watching YouTube or anything like that, go to this page, coldstartech.com/MSB. That's short for Make Space Boring, which is what we're all about. And drop in your email address there, and I will be able to do that for you. Make Space Boring is another little show that I run. It's a shorter format, quick interviews, and news of the day, and sometimes an update of who I'm meeting and what I'm learning in the space field. It's on the same Cold Star Tech channel. Speaking of which, on the YouTube channel, I can do something I cannot do on the audio-only version, which is add playlists. And so there may be topic area playlists on the YouTube channel that you would be interested in digging into and going down the rabbit hole and learning more about. For example, space law and policy, space situational awareness, lunar mining and construction and fun stuff like that. So go check that out. That is at coldstartech.com/play. That's the short link to get there. Anyway, thanks